Greetings from Mesa View United Methodist Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. Our traditional service is at 8:30 a.m. and at 11 a.m. we gather for contemporary worship. More information may be found at our website, mesaviewumc.com. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
Our epistle reading is 1 Peter 2, 2 through 10. The reading may be found on page 219 in the New Testament or on your screen. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation. If indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, "See, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." To you then who believe, he is precious. But for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the word, and as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
According to futurists, the first person to ever live to be 1,000 years old has already been born. That seems sort of hard to believe, but imagine where medicine might be in 25 years, let alone 50 or 75 years from now. We have no idea what might kill us now will be able to be cured then. And so I have to give at least the benefit of the doubt to those who study these things that might indeed be the case, or at least admit, well, maybe they're not alive yet. They will be born in the distant or the near future. Now, just to give you some perspective, if you had an ancestor who was still alive, who was born 1,000 years ago, they would have been born just at the time that the Chinese were perfecting gunpowder. The Emperor Charlemagne's death would have been as recent as Thomas Jefferson's death is for us, which really isn't all that long ago if you really think about it. They would have been old enough to have heard of or maybe participated in the Battle of Hastings in 1066, one of the most important events in Western history. They would have been alive when Macbeth became King of Scotland. They would have been alive 600 years later when Shakespeare wrote about Macbeth being King of Scotland. They would have been 500 years old at the time of the Protestant Reformation. That type of lifespan will change how we think about living, perhaps about how we love, and definitely how we relate as family. If they were still alive, we would be the 50th generation after their birth. Now, Rabbi Harold Kushner has written about what might happen if we were to have been immortal. And he's questioned whether people might actually stop having children. Just think of if everybody who was born 1,000 years ago and up to then was still alive, how many more people would be on the planet. So just simply by population growth, we might stop having children. And he said if we stopped, we would lose the joy and excitement that comes with young children. We would lose the understanding of what it means to be a parent. but also what it means to dedicate your life to somebody else and to be prepared to give your life for somebody else. And we would definitely lose the understanding of the needs of infants and of milk as a life-giving source, as we heard in that passage from 1 Peter. Now, this motif of milk and infants is not unique to 1 Peter or to Peter's writings. In the letter of Hebrews, we hear, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic elements of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. Everyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is unskilled in the word of righteousness." Probably a more famous passage from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. He says to them, "And so, brothers and sisters, I could not speak to you as spiritual people, but rather as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for solid food. Even now you are still not ready, for you are still of the flesh." Now, both of these passages from 1 Corinthians and from Hebrews are rebukes made towards the people in the Corinthian community and the group that the writer of Hebrews is addressing. And basically saying, look, you think that you're mature in the faith, you think that you know what's going on, but you're not. You're still infants. You can't eat the food that you should be eating because all you can digest is the milk of infants. You're not ready for the real meat of the faith. And yet, while these two passages are rebukes of these communities, they're also reminders of how it is that we start out in the faith, that our first meal is not steak and potatoes. We can't handle that as infants. We have to start out being fed milk until we can grow and become acclimated to eating something else, to eating solid foods, of maturing in our faith. And so when we hear Peter saying that we should long for the spiritual milk so that we can grow in faith, we should not hear this as a rebuke, the way that Paul and the writer of Hebrews are using it. Instead, we should see Peter saying this as good advice for us. As a reminder, we have to start out as infants. Now, no one yells at a baby for wanting milk. Well, when you're half asleep and exhausted because you're not getting any sleep and the baby is crying at 2 o'clock in the morning and you know the baby is hungry and it doesn't seem to want to eat, then you're yelling, but not really about them wanting milk, but the fact that they're not drinking that milk. So for normal, non-infant, non-sleep deprived people, you don't yell at babies about milk. Instead, we feed them milk because we know that's what's best for them. In order for them to get the nutrients they need in order to be able to grow and mature. And that's what Peter is encouraging to happen here in the first verse of the second chapter, which was not included. Peter says, "Rid yourselves, therefore, of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and slander." That is, move past the things of the flesh, as Paul would say, and become a new person. Be transformed by Christ. Be born again. That's what he's emphasizing in the first chapter of this letter. Not being born again the way we typically understand that phrase now, but about being freshly born into the faith. Which of all the things that come along with that includes drinking milk. And so Peter says, long for the spiritual milk so that we may grow into our salvation. Of course, that sounds easy, but it's not. There is an innate part of humans and of other animals that we know how to nurse after we're born. And it sounds really easy, but again, it's not. It takes a lot of fumbling and a lot of work with a newborn to get them to understand what they have to do. And new moms have to also understand exactly how this works. And so there has to be an intentionality when a baby is first born about nursing them. But like with other skills, later it becomes a little easier. And a mom can just pick up the baby and they'll work together. And sometimes she might even be able to go back to sleep, or at least semi-sleep, while the baby nurses. That's impossible to do in the first days after the baby has been born, even with a mother who's experienced with breastfeeding, because the baby is brand new to it. But more importantly, mothers who are willing to do this and keep doing it, even with the discomforts that might come with breastfeeding, which is more discomfort than some of you are feeling with the fact that I'm talking about breastfeeding. But as we celebrate our mothers and the other significant women in our lives, one of the things that we need to remember is that I believe that our mothers are the first people who ever show us what the love of God actually looks like. Now, this is not to dismiss the roles of fathers. We play a significant part, but that's for a different day's conversation. Although, as an aside, I read this past week that a study in Norway of men who took paternity leave, 50% of them, or they were 50% more likely to share in laundry responsibilities with their spouse than those who didn't take paternity leave. And in a Canadian study, those men who took paternity leave were more likely to spend time on domestic chores and childcare than fathers who didn't. So, as United Methodists, we promote both paternity and maternity leave as practices both for business and the legislative. But that's, again, totally off the topic, but something important for us to remember. And there are mothers who are unable or unwilling to show the love that we expect from mothers. And while it might not bring you comfort if that was your mother in your life, those are the exception to the rule. Now, obviously, I'm not a mother myself, and so I don't have that personal experience, but I've had plenty of women say to me that once they became a mother, that they truly understood what unconditional love meant. That what truly giving of yourself to another person, not for any gain on your parts, but simply to give, was like. A true and pure love for another person. But this can extend to more than those who have just given birth to us, because I think all of us, and I've never had anyone say to me it's not true for them, all of us have had another woman in our lives who's made a difference in our lives, who gave of themselves, who went above and beyond the expectations we would have for whatever role they might have, who adopted us as their own, sometimes literally, but usually metaphorically, to care for us as would our own mothers. A friend, a neighbor, a teacher. I've had numerous women who played that role in my life. Some teachers, some clergy mentors, but I had a Sunday school teacher in the 4th grade who stands out for me. I can't even remember her name. And I'm thinking, I was in 4th grade, so everybody was sort of older. And so I'm thinking she was maybe in her 30s, but I could be wrong on that. She did not have any children of her own, so she wasn't there because, she was wanting to make sure her children had a teacher. She was there simply because she wanted to be there. And she was one of those people who fanned the flame of faith in my life. Who might thinking of John Wesley or the Mesa story from last week, who strangely warmed my heart. And I don't know where I would be without her presence, of her giving of herself to me and the others in the class that year. She was one who made me long for spiritual milk. Who is that person for you? Maybe it's your mother. Maybe it's a teacher, a Sunday school teacher, an aunt. Perhaps it's even a man who fed your spiritual longing. But part of the point of this passage from 1 Peter, as well as from Paul and Hebrews, is that we cannot remain as infants in the faith. That we have to grow. Now, my wife, Linda, has perfect vision when it comes to spotting children. She can spot an infant at 200 yards. And then she gets all googly-eyed and says, "Oh, a baby, don't you miss that?" And I say, "No, I don't." There's things I miss about them when they're at that age, but as soon as we stopped having to do diapers, as soon as they could feed themselves and clothe themselves, those were good days. I'm happy that they're maturing, and Linda's happy about it too. Although we're only a few years from having our first teenager, there's times in which we don't love them as much as we might at other times. But they have to grow up. That means that we have to prepare them for growing up. We as Christians have to be willing to seek out more than just spiritual milk. That we have to grow up in our faith. And if we keep living only on our milk, then our faith will never mature. We'll never move forward. We'll never learn to feed ourselves. And we'll certainly never learn how to feed others. And so what Peter is saying to us is we have a choice. The first choice comes in longing for that spiritual milk. But once we've tasted, the second choice then comes to say that the taste is good and the Lord is good, and to seek more. And to come to Christ, a living stone, which has been rejected by mortals and yet chosen and precious in God's sight. We get to choose. We get to decide whether Christ is going to be the cornerstone of our lives or whether we're going to reject that cornerstone. Now, our mothers and our fathers and other important people in our lives have given us that spiritual milk that we need to start our journey. But eventually we have to choose whether we're going to continue or not, to follow the ways of God or to follow the ways of the world. Whether we are going to reject malice and insincerity and guile and envy and slander, as Peter says, or choose to live as Christ has called us to live. To see Christ not as a stumbling block, but as the cornerstone. And to begin to live like Him. And then if you're paying attention to what Peter says, once you've accepted that cornerstone, he does not say then build up your faith. Instead, he says allow yourself to be built up. That God does the building on the cornerstone once we put it into place. That God builds us up. God does the work in us. But we have to choose to allow that to happen, to open ourselves up to be changed, to open ourselves up to live and to love like God loves. And that's where we come back to our moms and the significant women in our lives again, the ones who show us the way, who feed us that spiritual milk, but then pushed us outside in order to be able to grow, to learn to eat like on our own. And Peter says that the followers of Christ are a chosen race, which means we're all of the same family. We're all related to each other. We're all mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers. So in fact, we have generations of faith, of wisdom that is passed on to us that goes back much farther than 1,000 years. It goes all the way back to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and to Mary Magdalene, the first one to encounter the risen Christ, the first one to give the message that Christ has arisen, to become the apostle to the apostles. And it continues to us today. We celebrate our mothers, not just because they gave birth to us, but we celebrate them because of the love they gave to us. They allowed God to build them up. And they became the example of God's love in our lives. A love given without price because there's nothing we could ever do to earn it. And a love offered without condition, that there was nothing we could ever do to lose our mother's love. They gave us the milk of life, the spiritual milk. And then taught us how to live for ourselves, to do things for ourselves. And as tough as it sometimes was, they told us to go out and fly. And they had to learn how to let go and hold on at the same time. Just like God does. That's what God's love looks like. And so we are given a choice of whether to follow or not. We are given a choice of whether Christ will be the cornerstones of our life or a stumbling block in our life. We are given a choice. And so it's a good time not only to celebrate and think about your moms, but think about what she would say to you, about the lessons that she taught you, about how we should live and how we should love. So on this day, let's listen to our moms, who loved us without condition just as God does, and choose to follow this day Christ, or follow Christ this day and every day. I pray that it be so, my brothers and sisters. Amen.